Discussion Series webinar. My name is Denise Kennedy, and I'm going to run through a few brief technical reminders before we begin the discussion about the Self-Certification Initiative. Your phone lines are muted. We will be taking questions through the chat feature. If you're experiencing any technical difficulties, also please use the chat function that is available to you at the bottom left of your screen. To respect everyone's schedules, we'll keep this moving so the session ends on time. Today, we welcome William Flew, Jane Robbins, and Eloise Lepisker from the Human Factors Engineering Office, part of the Office of Health Informatics. As mentioned before, if you have any questions for our presenters, please use the chat feature and we will stop the presentation intermittently to answer those questions. If we don't get to your questions, we will send out an email following this webinar with any relevant answers. To download the presentation, please click on the paperclip at the top right of the chat screen. With that, I'll turn it over to our presenter. Bill, over to you.
Thank you. So first and foremost, welcome everybody. As was mentioned, my name is William Flew. I'm part of the Human Factors and Engineering Office here at the VA. Today we're going to be presenting the Self-Certification Initiative, which is an initiative that myself and my colleagues, Jane Robbins and Eloise Lepisker, have been developing over the course of the last couple months. So today's agenda, we're going to give you a quick background. Following that, we're going to go into a brief discussion of the compliance process and where the self-certification initiative fits in there. Following that, we're going to go into the logistics and the process of the self-certification, as well as a discussion of personas, which are a core aspect of it. We're going to go into the user interface evaluation portion, the heuristic evaluation portion, discussion on the rankings of findings, and then lastly, the peer review. Following that, we will mention some resources that are going to be available with this, and then we will have an open question and discussion section. So as you all know, we all want to build great health IT products for veterans, caregivers, and clinicians. And with that in mind, the initial goals here were to build a process that is going to be able to support the ongoing self-certification for any VHA mobile apps. And to accomplish that, we started producing training materials so that project teams throughout the VA can check their own apps for user interface and heuristic issues. So I'm sure a lot of you are wondering, what is the purpose behind this? Why are we doing this? And in short, this is going to save a lot of time in the compliance process for project teams. It's going to help project teams to understand and use the same methodologies that are employed by human factors professionals. And by bringing this usability thinking into the app development process earlier, it's going to lead to better apps that are better built. And on top of that, it'll free up HFE resources so that we're able to engage earlier with project teams and have more impactful interactions on the mobile apps. So with the compliance process itself, as many of you may know, first an app will go through validation and verification. And this is the basic process that's going to occur when an app is being finished to ensure that it has basic functionality and meets all basic needs. Following that, it goes through a set of compliance reviews, including Section 508, Informatics Patient Safety, and then the Human Factors and Engineering reviews. And this is where we perform our heuristic evaluations, otherwise known as HEs, and the UI mobile evaluations, and there's the UI certs. So the self-certification process is going to replace HFE coming in and doing HEs and UI certs by training the app teams to perform these evaluations while they're building the apps. So from a high level, the self-certification would involve reviewing the UI criteria and answering the questions that are in that section. This includes reviewing them from the perspective of included personas, applying rankings to any issues found, as well as screenshots for documentation. Additionally, it's going to involve reviewing heuristics and looking for violations to those heuristics. That's the HE portion. Once again, rankings, personas, and screenshots are included here. And then following those two primary aspects, it gets passed up for peer review and findings are agreed upon. So to continue on with the logistics, this will include an Excel workbook template, and this is going to be hosted up on VA Pulse. You would simply download this, save a local copy of it with the app name. First, you would go into the UI tab. You'd end up going through the various UI-related questions. Anything that requires a screenshot, you could add that on in, and you would rank all the issues you find. Following that, you would go to the next tab on the Excel document, which involves the heuristic evaluation. Once again, you would go through the app, looking for criteria against the heuristics, add any findings that you find, and also screenshot and rank. And then following that, upon getting a peer review, simply save it and upload it to the HFE SharePoint repository, where we have all documents that have gone through this process. And so looking at a detailed process flow here, we can see at the start, you would begin through UI certification. Any items that don't meet the criteria, there's a comment section where you can add some context regarding the issue. If it's one that requires a screenshot, you can, of course, capture that and integrate that into the workbook, and then rank the priority of how high priority that issue is to fix. As for adding comments, there is reference guidance and a design tab reference to help you along there. Following the UI process, when you go through and check through all those criteria, you go into the HE. You're going to compare everything against the provided heuristics. Anything that doesn't meet a heuristic, of course, you would add the finding. Following that, you would add what specific heuristic was violated, which there's a reference tab for that as well. And then you can make a recommendation on what you feel will be the best course of action to fix this issue. Of course, capture and add screenshots, add rankings, and then after those two primary processes, you go over and do the peer review, reconcile and combine the peer review document and the original. At that point, you have a complete certification where you can save it and then upload it to the repository. So at this point, this is a quick halfway point. If there's any questions right now, please ask, and then we're going to go more in depth into the process.
Great, Bill, thanks. We do have two questions that have come up. Before we get into those, we are getting a little bit of feedback on your voice line. I don't know if maybe there's an electronic close to you. It sounds on a few different times a little bit choppy. But with that, Pauline wants to know when the MS Excel spreadsheet will be available on VA Pulse.
The workbook template will be available at the end of the month.
Excellent, thank you. And Alexis wants to know, how will peer review work?
It's a process among your peers. In general, you want somebody that is part of the process, but not a developer, to help accomplish it. So once you're done reviewing the app, it would end up being passed off to a project manager, a Scrum Master, anyone who's familiar with the app being created, but just not a developer, since they could have bias during. Review involves that person going in and completing their own review, comparing their findings against yours, and then the two reviewers would basically decide upon rankings together and just make sure they're in agreement for all issues that were found.
Thanks, Bill. That is, we'll move on and we'll come back to some more questions that are coming in now, so you can just continue on with the presentation.
Sure. So before we go into the actual review process, one thing I want to touch on, which is important, is personas. Personas are artificially created individuals, and these individuals represent the needs and the expectations of a larger group. So the number of personas that are also included in the workbook that you all have access to. These were developed by human factors engineering. These have been rigorously researched, and they're used to represent a particular population that the app may be targeted towards. And the benefit of this is doing an evaluation or using a persona perspective. It's going to help you in evaluating it and producing an experience much closer to what the end user is going to experience when going through the app. So, of course, these are going to be integrated into the workbook. You can see kind of little screenshots of those, but it's important to mention that they are integral to the process. So the first part of the self-certification is the user interface evaluation. Now this goes against a set of 8 criteria: consistency, which involves terminology, standard navigation, layout. One of the examples is terminology used throughout the application. And there's a number of different criteria points for each of these core 8 elements. Device orientation, stuff such as if the app can properly rotate between portrait and landscape, if it's applicable. Errors. Are errors described? Is there recovery possible when errors occur? Frequent interactions. Is navigation clear? Are you able to continue forward within the app and go back a step as typically intended? Mobile tasks. When you're presented with something that you typically have to go all the way through, is task abandonment available? Are the buttons that you would need to exit, you see them? Readability. Are all external links going to be properly denoted? Is instances of truncation avoided? Text size, scrolling, things of that issue. Sound. Any app where sound is going to be in here, is it adjustable? And lastly, user input. And this is making sure we have the proper size on any elements that are tappable, any entry field type indicators, things of that nature. So here we see a high-level example of the UI evaluation sheet. And you can see here, I can get my mouse. We have the categories, so consistency. These are 6 of the consistency ones. But the first one is terminology used consistently throughout the application. The finding was that this was not met here. It was marked as moderate. There are issues with the use of words login and tool. And for each one where guidance is needed, for example, with C02, does the application include standard navigation? You can see here for HTML5, you want a back button included within the app that goes up 1 level in architecture, not back 1 step. Browser-based apps be able to go back 1 page of browser. iOS, Android handle this very differently. And simply the navigation is not standard, it's just marked as serious. And you can see numbers here denoting what screen capture each of these issues would reference. And that's kind of an overview of what the sheet for the UI certification looks like. To look at a more in-depth example here, this is one for the errors category. Do error messages plainly and precisely describe how the problem, or describe the problem and how to recover? You can see criteria not met was minor. Error message was not received on the healthcare home screen. There's 0 put in a zip code, and yet no facilities were found. And we can see here, referencing the screenshot, the user had entered zip code while testing, tried to pick 5 facilities, nothing would have happened. You would expect some kind of context provided here, giving them an error message, or even just informing them there's no facilities. So this ends up getting denoted. There's guidance here, of course, to help you understand properly in evaluating the error message. And that's kind of the gist of how the UI certification is going through. The criteria are fairly straightforward, and then, of course, there's guidance provided in all of the columns to help ensure that you are judging it correctly. On to the heuristic evaluation. The heuristic evaluation involves whereas the UI cert, you're following a strict list of criteria. Performing a heuristic evaluation involves going through against this list of heuristics. Now, these are an industry standard that have been developed. They've been part of the human factors engineering community in general for, I believe, 10, 15 years now. So we have visibility of system status, matching between the system and the real world, user control and freedom, consistency and standards, error prevention, recognition rather than recall, flexibility and efficiency of use, aesthetic and minimalist design, help users recognize, diagnose, and recover from errors, and lastly, help in documentation. Now, each of these heuristics, of course, has much more context in it. Just for the sake of the presentation, we ended up pulling that out just to give you a base idea of them, but in the actual documentation that's provided as part of the training, all of these heuristics are elaborated on much more in depth. So to look at an example of this one, heuristic I, help users recognize, diagnose, and recover from errors. On this finding, the reviewer received a 403 error message when attempting to log in. Looking at it from the perspective of Dan or Joyce, 2 of our personas, this message may just cause them to give up and not trying to access the app. They're trying to log in, They don't receive any info here. All they get is error 403 forbidden and a big wall of text relating to the server. And in the context of the personas, those two particular personas, veteran users who are less tech savvy, and something like them, that's just going to be a server error. They're not going to know if maybe it's something like their internet, the wrong path. But the point was, just giving them error 403 forbidden isn't going to help the end user to understand what they did wrong. So, of course, we have the example recommendation here. Discover the reason for the error and tell the user how to fix it. And that's an example of a general heuristic write-up during the HV process of certification. Here we have another F, recognition rather than recall. This one involves minimizing the user's memory load by making object actions and options visible. A user should not have to remember information from one part of the dialogue to another. Instructions for use of the system should be visible or easily retrievable whenever appropriate. So in this example finding, we can see some graphs here. We have some lines on these graphs, but there's no action information. The finding was that the lack of labels on the different graphs would prevent users from accurately interpreting that data. Any of the personas who were applicable in this case, they may have trouble just remembering what those values would have been and what the ranges would have been. So this ends up getting rated as moderate. Example recommendation here, add X and Y axis labels to provide exact context for the highs and lows of the data range. So you've seen a couple of rankings up until now, and clearly not all issues are equal in terms of importance. So to discuss the ranking system, and there are 5 particular rankings, the 3 primary, minor, moderate, serious, and then of course not applicable and not evaluated. So with minor findings, these are things that they may cause user hesitation as they're interacting with the app. They may impede task or decrease efficiency, but these are things that users can work through. They may get a little annoyed. They'll still continue to likely use the app. They should be resolved, but they're the lowest priority. So an example of this is the use of click here for more, just to take the user out for an external link. They might not know. There should be ways to provide that context if necessary. So it's just something where we're forcing them to do more work. Moving on from there, we have moderate issues. Now, we're moving on a little bit higher up the ladder here, and these are things which they may start to cause actual task failure. Instead of just creating irritants for the end user, they could actually make them fail the task or cause some delays. Despite that, these are still things that the user can recover from, but it is going to negatively impact their use. And enough moderate issues could lead someone to just deciding that what they're using isn't worth their time. So they are important. They should get pretty high priority in resolution. An example of this is inconsistent access to app navigation. The menu buttons end up alternating between the left and the right side depending on the page. And it's, a prime example, something where somebody's working with an app and just that inconsistency is enough that eventually they may just get fed up with it and decide they don't want to use that app anymore, find something else. The top tier are serious issues. Now, serious issues, they always have the highest priority of resolution. And in general, we recommend that anything that gets identified as serious is always mitigated or resolved in some way before app deployment. The reason for that is serious issues, in general, they will always cause users to abandon the task. There's potential for diminishing the credibility of the VA, things that could crash the app altogether, kick the user out. Anything of that nature is going to be considered serious. So some examples here, pages in an app that are important that are completely blank, missing all information on them. Broken links within the app that are required for primary function. Constant crashes within the app with zero explanation. All of these are instances of problems where if a user encounters them, almost guaranteed they're going to decide the app is not worth their time and they're going to abandon it. So obviously the highest priority in resolution, because we don't want to spend time making these apps for instance, only to have them jump into the app, get set up with something, and decide they don't want to use it. The other 2 types of rankings are not applicable and not evaluated. Any issues like that in general, they can be either strengths or in some cases they're just unsolicited suggestions, things that may be seen as improvements, but they're not necessarily usability issues. And just to help differentiate it is important to know the difference between not applicable and not evaluated. So with the UI cert in particular, for example, if an app doesn't have sound features, the criteria of S01, which is when sound is inherent to application functioning, that would be considered a case of not applicable. Not evaluated, however, is something where while reviewing the app, the user didn't come across it, but to say that doesn't mean it's not necessarily. A prime example is error messages. You can never say an app has 0 error messages. Just because we haven't been able to find it at the point doesn't necessarily mean it isn't there. So a prime example of a issue that's been not evaluated in the UI cert, E02, which is the one regarding error messages, because as I mentioned, you can't be sure that you have not encountered one. So moving on from the HEUI and review, let's talk a little bit more about peer reviews. So as mentioned previously, based on the question, a peer can be any other person on the project team who did not develop the app. So this includes project managers, business sponsors, scrum masters, basically anyone involved in that process. And additionally, if at all possible, it's always good to have the peer review performed on a different device or a different OS from the initial review, just because this is going to help you to gain additional insight. And on top of that, there are many cases where something you encounter on, even take apps that are HTML5. There may be something you encounter on an Android device that's quite different on an Apple device, and for issues that exist on one platform that don't exist on the other. So another reason why peer reviews are so important. So to actually go into the process, the peer reviewer, they typically look at the first evaluator's findings, and they're going to see if they ended up having the same results if they agree with them. Following that, they would go through the app and also look for any additional findings that the initial reviewer may have missed. And then following this, the two reviewers would come together, agree on all findings and all severity rankings of said findings. And following that, the report is saved. So following this, we'll discuss the resources a little bit. We have the self-certification SharePoint site where everything will be uploaded when it's finished. On top of that, all training materials will be posted. SharePoint, but especially with contractors that.
Bill, I don't want to Bill, I'm sorry to interrupt you here, but we're losing audio for you. We can barely hear you on this side, just as we hit this slide on additional resources. If you're on a headset, sometimes it might be better to take the headset off.
No, not on my headset.
Oh, okay, I can hear you now. Thank you.
Strange. Well, as I mentioned, all training materials will be hosted on VA Pulse. This is a site that's external from the firewall, so even contractors that are just being brought in, they'll be able to access this. The only thing required is just a VA-assigned email. So all the training materials will be hosted there. That's going to include the Excel template that was previously discussed, as well as a job aid, which will help and train in performing this whole process. Following that, all completed evaluations should be uploaded to the HSE SharePoint site. Then we also have a support email that will be available to at least start. Both myself and Jane, kind of the four founders of this process, will be handling any support questions that come in at all. And following that, I'd like to open it up to any questions and discussion.
Excellent, thanks. We have a couple of questions here that have been building up. So the first is, what role on the project team is expected to do the initial human factors self-certification? I think you touched on this a little bit, but thought we should reiterate.
There's no one exact role that can do it. The only real stipulation is you shouldn't have the actual developer of the app do it. Aside from that, it comes down to who has the resources at the time. But any member of the project project team, aside from the developer, is appropriate for both the peer review or the initial review.
Excellent, thank you. And the next question was, has this process been piloted? And if yes, were the results satisfactory?
The process has been dry run. It hasn't necessarily been piloted. This is actually kind of the first instance of something like this being developed in the VA, just based on what we were able to find in the research we did. So we have done rigorous testing in-house with people on our team, at least, that are unfamiliar with the process, having them go through the materials and looking for areas in the training materials that seemed inconsistent or confusing at all, to make sure that when these materials are distributed, they are as concise and informative as possible.
Excellent. And we have a couple of questions around Pulse.
Mm-hmm.
How will we be notified that documents are on VA Pulse?
All the documents will be hosted by the end of the month. In addition, there's going to be a series of communications emails that are going to be sent out just to keep everyone updated on the progress, as well as informing everyone when the materials are available.
Excellent. And the next one around Pulse is, how do we report issues that come up before documents are on VA Pulse?
Could I get a little bit more context into the question?
Yeah, we'll ask that and come back to that. Victoria wants to know, will human factors be reviewing the reviews that are uploaded to their SharePoint?
Human factors will not be reviewing the reviews that are uploaded. The whole point of the process is so that project teams are able to certify themselves. That being said, of course, if there are difficulties or if you've gone through the process and you've gone through the peer review and you're still not sure about a particular issue, of course, our team is always available for support. Any questions or difficulty during the process, we're still going to be available. But the primary reason for that, having all that stuff uploaded, is so that during future app interactions, we have the documentation for what was already looked at on the app, what was already reviewed, and that will provide additional context that will help during any project studies that are established.
Excellent. And so we have a follow-up from that original question. We are beginning our ANI LFT this week. The documents to report issues will not be available for several weeks. How do we report app issues in the interim?
Well, in that particular case, that's a really good question. I would say the best thing I can say is I'd have to touch back with my team. I know we've had some people in HFE that are already involved in the ANI projects than I was previously. So if there's not already interaction, it may be one that we get involved with. But just feel free to send me a follow-up email, and I can provide additional information after touching base with everyone.
Excellent, thank you. And we have a couple questions just sort of swooping in here. One of them is there a current human factors presence on VA Pulse that attendees can explore?
Currently, the materials are still being finalized before being uploaded to the website. We have a page established, but none of the actual training materials are currently hosted.
Excellent. And is this expectation that this process will be implemented as soon as the Excel document is available at the end of the month?
That's correct.
Okay. And Alexis wants to know, to help with budgeting our time, how many hours does it take to conduct the review?
The training itself would probably run approximately 3 to 4 hours just to learn the whole process. Now, your very first app, like anything, my estimate, and of course this does vary depending on how big the app is and how much there is in the app, but I would expect someone's very first review after being trained to take anywhere between 2 to 3 hours. Once you become more familiar with the process, a single review of the app can be accomplished in as little as about an hour to 90 minutes, just depending on your level of familiarity and confidence while going through.
Okay, it looks like there's a couple more people typing, but we don't have any additional questions just yet. I wanted to check in with Jane and Eloise to see if they had anything to add, as I think we've gotten them unmuted now.
This is Jane. I just wanted to make it clear that this is not a JIRA kind of process. In other words, ongoing issues with apps won't be reported. This is a spot-in-time kind of process at a time when, the app was close to being released. So I think one of the questions, it sounded a little bit like there was, some kind of ongoing reporting of issues, and that's actually not the case. It's going to be a one-time situation evaluation. And, the reason is, folks, it's going to be really, really informational for everyone because you're going to learn a little about what human factors does, and then hopefully apply that to the apps that you work with.
Excellent. Thank you for that. And we have one more question here. Patient safety requires human factors review before they start theirs. Have you worked with them to understand how their process may adapt to accommodate this?
Yes, we have. Patient safety, we touched base with them to see if there was anything in particular regarding our process that they looked for before beginning theirs, and there weren't any particular items. So as part of the new process, basically when it gets uploaded to the HFE SharePoint server, that'll be the flag for patient safety to commence their review.
Okay, and Damian wants to know, why can't the development staff perform the certification, especially since they are more intimate with the details?
That's basically the real reason. Being somebody that developed the app, while you are the one with the app and all the different processes of the app, you also have some bias, and it's a little bit harder to approach the app from the perspective of a persona, just because you spent so much time. Think about sending a document out for a white glove, and you typically send it to somebody that hadn't seen the document at all before to read it through, just because after, reading a document so many times, there's things that you're bound to overlook just because of the way our brains work. And it's very similar with the review process. Having somebody that spent, countless hours working on the app and putting in the code, there may be things that they just assume will work because of the code and not necessarily test, which is why it's always better to have someone who is not a developer perform the review.
Can I add a clarification? At least not a developer who's worked on that particular app. It could be someone who's worked on other apps would be accepted.
Yes. One great way, assuming you have the resources, is to basically, if you have a developer working on app A and a developer working on app B, when those apps are done, B could review A's and vice versa. You don't want to review your own app that you've been working on.
So you talked a little bit about it being able to be additional developer team. We have a follow-up question really about roles here. If it's not the developer team, are you thinking it would be the project manager? The comment is that they don't have the bandwidth. V&V could likely do this if the PM approved. Any other thoughts on the role of who could approve this beyond the additional developers?
I mean, it really comes down to your project team and who's involved with it. But I mean, the biggest thing is just not the person who was developing the actual app. I'd have to get a little bit more context into everyone on your team to suggest an ideal person, but there really isn't a necessary ideal individual to perform the initial review.
Excellent. Thank you for that. I see a couple people typing. We don't have any additional questions. I wanted to just wait a second and see as the chat's a little slow to appear. I didn't know, Bill, if you have any final thoughts while we wait for any additional last call for questions.
Nothing really regarding the process. I just want to make a mention that probably the biggest benefit that feels going to come from this for everyone is getting this kind of usability thinking into apps and training the project teams. I feel that's going to lead to much cleaner and much more usable apps, which will be a big improvement for our user base.
Excellent, thank you. Oh, I'm sorry, was that someone else speaking? All right, we're getting a little feedback there. Well, I think we're in a good place to close today. I want to thank everyone for participating. We're going to end the session and ask that you fill out a questionnaire that will be sent to you following the presentation. Let us know how we're doing and any other additional topics that you'd like to hear about. I hope everyone has a good rest of your Friday and a great weekend. And thanks so much to our presenters, Bill and Jane and Eloise. We really appreciate your participation today. Thanks all. Have a good day.